in the last couple of weeks, we're hoping that we can make this a conversation between Trey and myself. We're both assistant professors of agricultural, food, and resource economics at MSU, just trying to figure out how we think about this time, this kind of frantic time, just between ourselves, but also for kind of stakeholders and other interested parties in the industry. So if you do have a question or a comment, or you want to call us out for saying something dumb, you can type any of that stuff into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom, and that will come directly to Trey and I, and we can address that. So feel free to send us those. So Trey, I guess let's start off by saying, what is this, the third week of kind of lockdown is this the second week? It feels like 5 years, but the second or third week of lockdown here in Michigan. We've seen kind of economic and disease information get worse and worse. What has changed since last week? And I guess specifically, you and I were talking about some of the unemployment figures. So where are we at right now in terms of unemployment?
Well, I mean, I think you're right that things have gotten a little more dramatic. So I've shifted gears. So last week I was drinking beer. Yesterday was Gin and Tonic Day, National Gin and Tonic Day. I figured I'd make it Michigan. So it's going to be Verner's and some Long Road gin for today. So it's going to be a gin and ginger Michigan style. We talked about last week that 2 weeks ago, Michigan unemployment hit over 240,000 in 2 weeks, which is a pretty shocking number, really. The unfortunate reality is that jobless claims are up again as of yesterday. So this is weekly jobless claims ending in week of April 4th. We've hit 384,000 in just that 1 week. So jobless claims in the United States were still at over 6 million in that third week, but in Michigan, where the U.S. it kind of plateaued a little bit, and in Michigan we actually saw an even more dramatic increase, or just an increase in general.
So how about that, Trey? So it looks like you're saying these initial filings are still growing in Michigan, but you said for the U.S. as a whole, we saw, what was it, 6.9 million the last time it was reported, and then 6.6 million initial claims this week. So
well, is that 6.6 and then 6.3, but same trend line.
Is that to what extent is that comforting? Or is that suggesting that unemployment is trending back down? What does that mean?
I mean, there is this rate of change shift that might be happening, that maybe we hit the worst total number 2 weeks ago. There could be a couple pieces of information in there, though. It could be that we just literally have a system that can only enroll something like 6 million people a year, or a week, sorry. And so that's we're hitting like a censored line. But like we literally can't even register more than 6 million people a year. So if you want to think about a production possibilities frontier, we've hit the production possibilities in terms of filings. It could be also that we're seeing a lot of variation at the state level. So as I mentioned, Michigan is up, but that means that there are other states that are down. And so there's probably a lot of information that we could start at least exploring.
So just to clarify, though, that doesn't mean that unemployment is going down. It's that the initial filings, the rate of change has dropped.
Right.
And so I've read somewhere of the million places we've been talking about, we've got, 17 million now, a total of 17 million unemployed, which is a larger number, not in terms of share of the population, but a larger just kind of raw number than we saw in the Great Depression. I don't think that this means that this is equivalent to or as bad as the Great Depression.
Yeah, so just because you're having Great Depression numbers doesn't necessarily mean we're in the Great Depression. So we've expanded in the United States who can file for unemployment. So it's not even really fair to compare unemployment numbers this week to this time last year, because we're capturing different groups of the population. But it is striking to think that as of right now, the number of people who are working, and I think even the share of people who are working in the United States is less. Again, the share of people is less than what we would have seen, especially in the Great Recession and in all following recessions. I think maybe the Great Depression, if not, it's close.
I think we're still well below the Great Depression. There were a lot less people in the United States than there were then. Importantly different, though.
The share. But yeah.
Right. The share is much less than the Great Depression still.
Yeah.
An important difference, though, is the policy used to back up or support those experiencing unemployment now, as opposed to just the catastrophe back then. So you said, one, what the definition is a lot different, and two, the implications of that is importantly different. So we're not in the same world. With that in mind, so that's the unemployment side of things. What are some other broad, I guess, economy-wide trends you're seeing?
Well, so one thing that I know a lot of people are very interested in is the housing market. And the reality is that housing market data is a little bit hard to come by. This stuff's happening so rapidly, and there's so many variations across locations. There has been some interesting reporting coming out of Redfin on how coronavirus is impacting the housing market. So this is one of 11 charts, and this is the year-on-year change. So this week last year versus this week this year of pending home sales in the United States. So the year-on-year change as of this was March 29th. 42% down versus March 29th of last year. And if you'll see the trend there. So it's there's definitely a trend line here that is not positive.
So diplomatically said.
Yeah,
but this is the same kind of thing that we have to have these qualifiers here, that we can't compare these sales, pending home sales, to anything, the Great Recession, any of the other recessions, because of the fact that this has a lot of potential to be a sit and wait, like a freeze of the economy and then start back up, rather than some kind of structural shift in where the economy is going.
Yeah, absolutely. As of right now, I mean, the people are keeping their eye on home mortgages, and those markets are kind of nerve-wracked. But like, I don't think there's been, we haven't seen the housing crisis of the 2008 recession play out the way that it did then now. So this data is just interesting to keep up with, I think.
Yes. And so we got everything going crazy. We've got we've got unemployment going up. We've got housing sales going down. We talked last week about prices going crazy. What does that mean, I guess, for consumers, kind of for household welfare?
Okay, so one thing that we've done so far is we've kind of structured our conversation about what we knew last week versus what we know this week. So this week, there is an interesting new piece of consumer data that was released just this morning, it's called the CPI. And the CPI is generally used to try to adjust for kind of inflation, if you want to think about that. And the way that they collect the CPI is by effectively going out and checking prices of items at different times or every month, and then they report how those prices change. Okay, so a 1 month percent change in CPI is presented here. Okay, so there's a percent change from the prior month. And if you'll notice, in general, we saw some type of kind of inflationary or a growth in inflation. March, as of this morning, is down. What does that mean?
Stuff's going better for consumers. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. What does that mean? I mean, it's an open-ended question. The way I tried to explain it this morning is it's like asking a checkers player how to explain Dungeons and Dragons strategy.
You said that so much better this morning.
I know you're right. But the problem is that, like, okay, so this is the classic problem with economists. Somebody calls an economist and they say, I want you to give me a number. And the economist throws out like 6, but like, what does that 6 mean? The economy is going to do 5. Okay. What is 5? So the CPI breaks down into different formats. Okay, so there's an all-item CPI, there's a food CPI and energy, and then all other items. Now the Fed, when they're trying to target inflation, they're looking at what's called core inflation. So they drop off some of these more volatile markets. So notice the big changer here. It's not necessarily food and energy, or less food and energy. It's totally energy. So energy prices, as you might have noticed, have plummeted. So there was some reporting out of Detroit. They're hitting less than $1 a gallon on gas right now in Detroit.
And that's pretty important in terms of what this means for households, considering we're all stuck at home, right? So this is
we're not driving.
Hilariously illusory benefit potentially to households.
So this is also really interesting to me because the March numbers line up pretty nicely with the February numbers. And the BLS actually kind of explained this a little bit, saying that they had to collect basically all their data at the beginning of the month. So at the beginning of March is what they're looking at. And then they had to shift to online tracks. So, where historically people would go into grocery stores and literally look at the price in the grocery store and write it down on their little piece of paper, they can't do that now. So this data collection process is fundamentally different. So even the BLS is saying, look at this number, take it with a grain of salt. And I think honestly is also setting the stage for the same conversation here in a month, because the August number or the April numbers are going to be probably pretty nutty, I would guess.
So you're saying, I think kind of the takeaway of what you're saying is you just put a whole bunch of statistics on the Zoom. We shouldn't believe any of the statistics, right? That's what you're saying.
Well, I think that statistics show you how difficult it is to parse through an economy with just one base number.
So then let's turn, I guess, to some of that more complexity.
Yeah. So just and to launch into that, notice, okay, so this food number, it just says food. So about half of that food number comes from food away from home, and half of that food number comes from food at home. Okay. And so like think about what's happening in these two marketplaces. One has basically bottomed out, and the other one has seen kind of this unprecedented increase. So with the change in the way that people are buying, we'll start with energy. Energy's how it relates to agriculture is in large part because of ethanol. So we grow a lot of corn in the United States, and ethanol is a large part of the demand system for ethanol. So weekly output, if you look at total weekly output, I don't know if you can see that number very well, but it's plummeting year on year from April last year to now. It's crazy how low it's gone in terms of total U.S. output per week. So we're creating less of a demand for our corn products through this decrease in demand for energy.
Do you know, to what extent is this supply and demand driven versus regulatorily driven?
Yeah, it's hard to say. The hard truth is that a lot of us probably wouldn't be driving anyways. We'll talk here in a little bit about the change in the executive orders here in Michigan on what you even can drive to do. But just in general, energy prices across the board, not just because of COVID-19, but also for a lot of other global forces, have been driven extremely low. If you want to read more about kind of what that's looked like in the past, there is a lot of really interesting stuff on what's called the Penn Square Bank crisis that happened back in the 80s. Penn Square Bank was a bank in Oklahoma City that basically was throwing out crazy loans for oil and gas operations in Oklahoma and Kansas. It kind of created this large financial crisis. So this isn't the same thing, but that's probably the most illuminating example of what's happened in recent history that might be a corollary.
So that's oil prices. Won't you turn to food prices?
Yeah. So there have been articles all over the place about national shell egg indices, and everybody says, well, egg prices are skyrocketing and everything else, and there is this conversation about hoarding and everything. Record numbers of baby chicks are being sold. So like that was all over the news. Well, guess what's happening to egg prices? Now they're starting to come back down. Okay, so this is as of last night. The trend line would stay the same, but 2019 U.S. and California prices tracked really well together in 2019, and 2020 it looks like we're seeing the same track, at least, where you see like a high point, and now we're going to come back down, and I think over time we're going to see more consistent egg prices with what we would expect in the standard supply chain, regardless of COVID-19.
So I think there's two aspects of that. I am not as hopeful as you that egg prices are going to return to regular norms. So we had this short-term shift right in the source, the location of where people are buying their food, and we had a lot of scarcity and maybe some concerns about scarcity. There were some regulatory issues that kind of ironed out some of the ability to shift our supply from one side to the other. But I think an important thing about this is potentially, and so in a couple of weeks we can talk to see which one of us was right. But the important thing about this is the way that people eat at home versus the way that people eat away from home. And that I am a terrible cook, but I can cook you a mean egg, right? So I'm going to be eating a lot more eggs at home than I would have if this supply restriction wasn't, or if this shelter-in-place restriction wasn't on. So I anticipate that at least in the medium term, this will stay higher than in the past.
Okay, so your comment on restaurants is really good and leads us into the next one, I think, really well.
You're like, I don't want to talk about anything you just said.
No, but you're right. I do want to talk about what you said. I just want to say, like, oh, I can shift my my cooking habits to eggs easy. It's not as easy for me to cook bacon, if you want to think about it that way. So most of the bacon that we eat in the United States is consumed at restaurants, or a lot of the bacon is, and all of a sudden we're actually experiencing some level of people are calling it a bacon glut. So like all of the bacon sales that people were counting on in this supply chain that were happening in restaurants has now basically disappeared. And so here's a figure that I stole from Jason's blog that shows wholesale daily pork prices in 2019 versus 2020. Now notice how, again, it tracks fairly consistently prior to the 22nd of March. And then there is this massive shift in the way that we're buying pork. And I think that's exactly consistent with your story that you're talking about with eggs.
But so this one is even more complex than the egg story, in that there are two things we're talking about here, right? So the first is the way we consume our food at home versus the way that food is consumed, the way my burgers are consumed with a ton of bacon on top of them at the Peanut Barrel. An equally or probably more important aspect of this is the way that the supply chain works and the way that the processors work. So I wonder if you can talk some about that.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely true. If you go look at the data, about 60% of our pork in the United States is processed in 15 facilities, and in those 15 facilities, we've already started seeing certain outbreaks of COVID-19, which has forced these facilities to have to close. And as we move forward in this COVID-19 world, that is more and more of a concern, that you shut down a supply chain. Now that shutdown has got two kind of strange implications if you think about it from a consumer. Your immediate thought is, oh, that'll be great for that might be good for producers, but the reality is that they're actually not going to be able to find as much of a demand side for the pork that they're raising. So for producers, for growers, this is actually probably not a good thing. Now for the consumer market, you might actually see some type of a constraint on the supply that's reaching the end market, and so those prices will come back up. So you're going to see potentially an increase in the gap between what the wholesalers are paying for the hog and what the consumers are paying for the product.
And so I guess thinking more broadly than just hogs or beef or eggs, maybe that risk runs with foods that have a longer supply chain because there's more sources of risk. So I guess there's some level of concentration in these markets, but also those that have a longer supply chain from farm to fork run risks at each of those points of those kind of bottlenecks.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point, because if you look at the on the beef side, so there's all kinds of conversation right now that we mentioned last week on kind of public policies associated with beef. Wyoming actually just passed a law, they're the first one in the U.S. to allow for producers to process their own product and sell direct to consumer through like a share of the cow. So that again is trying to eliminate some of this middle space. I would imagine that you're going to see more of that kind of stuff. And now it's not clear that really is the end solution to any of this. But
all these policies are temporary because this is a kind of an immediate thing where you don't want to make long-term solutions on things that are happening.
This is unprecedented. So we'll see how this all goes. But there are just so many implications of like this immediate shift in the way that we've set up our supply chains. The next one that's made a bunch of news is chicken wings. So again, you don't think about this stuff, but because we decided we weren't going to do March Madness this year, there was a massive decline in demand for chicken wings. And with that decline in sales, we've seen a decline in prices because of the relationship between price and quantity. So even though you got this kind of nice historic annual boost from sales during high level events, those events didn't happen, and that matters for poultry. It's kind of like our milk story last week about how if you close the schools, you think you're just closing the schools, but actually you're hitting the demand side for milk pretty hard.
And I think so in response, particularly to this kind of the dynamic nature of these industries where you've got to, if I want to sell a chicken on this date, I've got to start growing it a long time before that. So we've got these populations of animals, not only chickens, but hogs and potentially beef, that are too big for the current supply in a lot of these areas. So my understanding, and maybe you can talk more about that, is that there have been discussions of depopulation for some of these livestock.
Depopulation?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of concern in any of the supply chains right now as to who's going to buy this stuff. I think there's a lot of frustration on the livestock side because you can't just immediately kind of jump in and have more or less cows. There is a cattle cycle.
It's a lot easier to have a lot less cows than it is to have.
Well, yeah, fair. But you can't just immediately jumpstart a supply chain like that.
So tell me about that. So you said there's this demand response. We've got these stocks hanging around. That demand for a lot of our products could be local, but in agriculture kind of as a whole, we're a large net exporter. And so are some other countries. I wonder if you could talk about maybe the international markets.
Yeah, so actually I'm not sure that the media is covering this part maybe as thoroughly as they are in changes of U.S. consumer demand. But there has been a pretty impressive change in the way that these export markets are starting to play out. So this is from an IFPRI product called it's their export tracker. And so this isn't a perfect measure by any means.
Export restrictions tracker, I think.
Yes, an export restriction tracker from IFPRI. And this is basically, we just threw this together. This is the cumulative number of countries with an export restriction and the cumulative number of products that are restricted. And so at the beginning of all of these conversations that Schaefer and I had, we were saying, maybe we'll all come together and we'll realize that we need to do this.
I really did. I was like, this is the thing that's going to change the hearts and minds of the world.
Right. And we had high hopes, but unfortunately, it does not look like that's where the world's going. So this is if you'll notice the trend line, more and more countries and more products are experiencing some type of an export restriction. And so for folks out there that aren't really thinking about import-export, an export restriction means that, let's say you grow wheat in Kazakhstan, you're not allowed to ship your wheat out of Kazakhstan now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a good thing for the producers in those countries, but it is a very protectionary measure.
Right. So in terms of kind of the economics there, it drives down the domestic prices in those countries that have the export restrictions. It drives up prices to everyone else in the world, right? And so if we're thinking about this as we are a fellow exporter of this product, so say wheat, which has been the case in a lot of these, this is a good thing for us, right? So as Kazakhstan restricts its trade in wheat, the international price of wheat goes up, which potentially helps our farmers. If we're thinking about things that we're a net importer of, like a lot of specialty crops, this is a bad thing, well, a good thing for our domestic producers from Michigan, and a bad thing for the domestic consumers.
For the consumer, because it decreases the price.
And so
it increases the price. It increases the price of the product,
right.
or the availability of the product. So you have to keep in mind that fresh fruits and vegetables are seasonal at some level, and while we do have a world where we can actually store things better than we could have in 1990, there is still growing seasons that you have to be aware of when you start thinking about imports and exports of specialty crops.
And so before we move on, we've got a question from Lourdes Martinez, which is this food alone? And so just as a point of clarification, this is restrictions, correct me if I'm wrong, Trey, this is restrictions on food and agricultural products, kind of broadly defined, where most of these are at the primary level of processing. So this is going to be rice, wheat, oil seeds, rather than more processed products. It contains nothing outside of kind of the agriculture and food.
Right. I mean, there is story after story about restrictions on like PPE and medical equipment right now across countries. But that's not what this is trying to capture.
Right. And so Lourdes Martinez also asks, are we saying export bans what we're meaning here? And the answer is yes. So these are, as I understand it, not just increased export tariffs. These are prohibitions. So you are not allowed to export any of these products.
That's my understanding of their data. I don't know how they're actually implementing the policies, and it probably varies a little bit. It is interesting to point out that these countries are from all over the world. So Honduras is on the list, just like Russia, and so.
But so in general, though, if you look at kind of the general, you're right that there are some exceptions, but they tend to be exactly the Soviet countries, the post-Soviet satellites that were centrally planned. So your discussion of, I don't know how this is going to work, probably more successfully in those countries than some that are more laissez-faire historically. Yeah.
So to continue on the bad trade news, the WTO is kind of projecting that we're going to see a pretty dramatic shift in international trade, or a restriction in international trade in 2020. They're kind of throwing out scenarios, so this isn't hardline data, but I think it's pretty clear. And if you're interested in this topic more, there's a really good WTO webinar of 6 trade economists discussing this specific point that I'd be happy to show you. But I don't think this surprises anybody, right? That if you have these countries that are already shifting towards some type of an export restriction strategy, there are probably other countries that are going to try to pull back as best as they can on trade in general.
I totally agree, but I wonder if potentially people are rolling their eyes about all this international discussion, and if we could back to kind of more local news and whether there's anything.
Well, local news is
in the last week,
also gin and ginger. So, so yesterday, I think agriculture in Michigan kind of was dealt a pretty rough blow. These restrictions here in Michigan has extended to greenhouses and garden centers, and actually it is taking a little bit of a step forward, where even like the Home Depots of the world aren't technically allowed to sell this type of product. So this is pretty scary for an industry that relies on this time of year to make most of their money. And as this pandemic rolls longer, which there's no indication that this is going to slow down yet in terms of restrictions, I think we're gonna see a lot of really rough stories come out in the news about these greenhouse and garden centers.
And so this is to me the heart of the kind of big economics question of, okay, we've got this pandemic. It's the first one we've had in a long time. How do we manage the economic costs of social distancing with the public health impacts of these social distancing things? So the way we've currently done it is to divide businesses into essential businesses and non-essential businesses, and kind of said that those that are essential are allowed to continue operating, or even are required to continue operating in some cases, and those that are non-essential are not allowed to continue operating. Last time, Trey, you and I sort of talked about this distinction, how maybe it's arbitrary and the right way to regulate this thing. And you, if I remember correctly, which I always do, you started this thing out from a really Austrian perspective, saying, there shouldn't be regulation. Who needs the government? And by the end of it, you had grown a Karl Marx beard, and you had said that the answer to everything is to have a central planner that gives free money to everyone in the world.
I will say, if I'm not allowed to get a haircut anytime soon, I'm gonna have Karl Marx hair too.
Dude, mine's looking rough too, man. So the good point here is we've got someone today.
Yes.
We were kind of talking theoretically about kind of trade-offs that you and I, as agricultural economists, aren't the experts in. We're not prepared, I think, to talk about that complete trade-off. So we went out and we talked to Felicia Wu, who is a former professor of public health and at University of Pittsburgh, and is the current distinguished professor of food toxicology. Am I right about that, Felicia?
It's actually food science and human nutrition, but
I was totally wrong.
All right.
Okay, yeah, food science and human nutrition, who is an expert on these things and is prepared to help us talk about some of those trade-offs. So Felicia, as a start, I wonder if you could kind of, maybe you can introduce yourself in a way that was better than I did, but if you could talk about the public health side of that trade-off. How do we think about this distinction between essential and non-essential, and what are the implications of that for public health?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to join this session. I've enjoyed watching you for now over these last 3 weeks and learning a lot on the AgEcon side and the problem with respect to multiple different food and resource supply chains. If I could actually start, if you don't mind, Alex, by you and Trey had shared a lot of bad news over the course over the course of the last week. And by the way, you're not, for some reason the video is not allowing me to join via video. So, and I'm fine with that. But if you wanted to,
well, I would love to see it. Let me
do that.
Figure this out.
Okay, that's okay. So while you're figuring that out, I would like to share some cautiously good news, if I can, with the audience on the public health and the medical side. So there's been a lot going on, obviously, with respect to trying to estimate how many cases and how many deaths might be expected in the United States and also in the state of Michigan. And there have also been a lot of questions and concerns with respect to the different types of whether there's certain antivirals, certain types of medicines, certain types of vaccines that could be helpful to us. And this week, it's been all cautiously positive news. So let me add that point. Just yesterday, Dr. Anthony Fauci, whom many of you may recognize as being on the US Coronavirus Task Force, he's the director of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, has stated that he is actually now decreasing the predicted number of deaths in the United States from coronavirus for the rest of this year. About 2 weeks ago, a study had come out of the Imperial College London that had really shocked and scared us, saying they were predicting that in the United States, there could be as many as over 2 million deaths by the end of the year from coronavirus. And of course, that was a number that was just not acceptable to us. Later, Dr. Fauci backed up, he took these data and looked at the cases of the fact that we've been social distancing, and he reduced the expected number of deaths from somewhere between 100,000 to 200,000 Americans. Just yesterday, he brought it down even further. He said, because we're doing such a great job as a whole in the United States with social distancing, now it decreased from over 2 million predicted deaths to about 60,000.
Wow.
So it's a huge difference.
That's a big update.
Let me understand one part of this, Felicia, which is the conversation we've been talking about kind of as the call to action for social distancing, which is the concept of flatten the curve. So
Yes.
how much of these reduced numbers is the result of lesser burdens on our healthcare system versus just the case fatality rate of the disease?
That's a great question. And I think that there are at least two important points to that, which is that there seems to be pretty much agreement based on what we've seen of coronavirus cases around the world, that the case fatality rate does depend on the availability of hospital beds, of ICU beds, and of ventilators. And if you have a healthcare system that is overwhelmed, then the case fatality rate from coronavirus is likely to be a lot higher than in a community, in a situation in which the healthcare system is not overwhelmed, and you can have the optimal level of healthcare that you need if you do test positive for COVID-19. So there is that aspect. In addition, simply because we are practicing social or physical distancing, there's a lot less transmission. So we're reducing this key variable in epidemiology called R0, which you probably have heard a lot about. It's if you're infected, how many more people on average will you infect in your community? And that R0 has decreased substantially because we are practicing social distancing. So in addition to better healthcare abilities, there's also a reduced number of cases.
Felicia, can I ask you just one more kind of nitty-gritty infectious disease question before we turn to the kind of the economic versus public health trade-off, which is the concept I've heard a lot about, the idea of herd immunity. You talked about the fact that we're reducing this thing called R0, which means we are reducing the rate of spread of any one person getting infected. My understanding is that there is also this kind of epidemiological trade-off there, which is, in some sense, the more people we can get that have become immune to this disease, the better off we are in the future in terms of that immunity kind of protects the rest of the population. So is this reduced spread, what potential implications are there of that reduced spread on this idea of herd immunity and the time it takes to acquire herd immunity?
That's a great question, Alex. There are two different ways to acquire herd immunity. The one that is less optimal, that we want to try to minimize if we can, is simply more people becoming infected. And you're right that, of course, if we're social distancing, there's going to be few of us that are becoming infected with SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus. So right now, we're not increasing herd immunity that way by all sheltering in place. There's another way, thankfully, that we can increase herd immunity, and that is through vaccines. Of course, because this is a novel coronavirus, we don't have any vaccines right now available widely to administer to people. However, we do have positive news of a number of different companies and universities, not just in the United States, but around the world, that are developing vaccines that can, a number of them are already in phase 1 clinical trials. What's meant by that is that phase 1 clinical trials is that they're being tested in human volunteers first to make sure that the vaccines themselves are safe. If the vaccines are shown to be safe, then they move on to phase 2 and then phase 3 clinical trials. And that means, well, are they actually effective in preventing coronavirus infection? And if so, how much and in what way should it be administered to be the most effective? So right now there are a variety of different vaccine candidates that are available. Some are the traditional injection through the arm. Some are through microneedles, which is wonderful for people who are not that fond of getting a needle in the arm.
What is a microneedle?
Yes. Microneedles are just very, very fine needles. The pain associated with the injection is considerably less.
Okay.
And it gets better. Yes, yes.
And so we've got a question here. I promised that I was going to stop asking these epidemiological questions, but we have another one, which maybe is for both Felicia as a public health person, but also Trey as a behavioral economist, which is one viewer is slightly concerned about the idea that when you look at the numbers from Singapore, when you look at the numbers from South Korea, we are seeing a little bit of a blip in terms of that second wave in terms of infections. So I wonder if you could talk about, one, whether that's a possibility, and two, the behavioral aspects of this, that if we delay, we're kind of slowing that are not biding our time for a vaccine. Maybe this is for Trey, but whether over time people will get tired of this, the huge private costs of themselves, while not really seeing the benefits in terms of the counterfactual, what infections would have occurred had I not been staying at home. So I guess I'll go to Felicia first. Okay,
I was just going to say I'm happy to yield to Trey first, but I'm glad to give some
talk a lot.
thoughts.
Go for it.
Okay. It's absolutely true that coronavirus cases can potentially rebound after coming out of social distancing. And there was an excellent piece in the New York Times that was all about how would we know that it's okay to reemerge in situations like this. And with the addition that with the caveat that there's some uncertainty surrounding these types of issues. Some of the things that we know that are important to say when can we really start the economy is the following: that we would know that all the hospitals in the area would be able to safely treat all patients that would require hospitalization, that we should be able to test at least everyone who has symptoms, that the local health system is able to conduct monitoring of confirmed cases and contacts, and probably most importantly, something that we could all understand, that there has to be a sustained reduction in cases for at least 14 days. And the reason that we roughly say that 14-day estimate is that that's kind of the upper end of the limit of if you do become infected with coronavirus, how many days are necessary before you start to show symptoms, and to quarantine yourself and also to warn the people that you have been in contact with.
And so that's sort of the public health side of these things, of the when should people exit this shelter in place stuff. I want to talk to Trey, if you're willing to share some thoughts in that. Well, Trey and I are both from Kansas, and you will probably have seen that in Kansas they decided for Easter Sunday, which is this week, whether you like it or not, they have decided to open up churches for just this one time for Sunday. And I think that's indicative of the willingness to give up willingness to incur these private costs of social distancing, and maybe my tiredness of complying with these social distancing orders while not being able to observe the benefits. Trey, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I've got a few thoughts as always, but the first one is when we talk about like a number of cases decreasing, that's in some part a function of how much we're testing, so especially as soon as the question comes up about comparing across countries, I kind of bristle a little bit because and Felicia and Alex and I already talked about this some, so I don't think this is a surprise to them, but I just don't understand how you can have two different measurement systems, like for one country that's testing at a certain rate and another country is testing at a different rate, and then you make these figures that I just put up. So if you notice, the United States total number of tests has increased significantly from February 18th to April 9th. The total number of new confirmed cases is quite correlated. So I mean, at some level, you're kind of recognizing that, of course, as we ramp up testing, we're going to see more cases. So when we start thinking about different states, to me, so in Kansas and Oklahoma, for example, you don't have that many confirmed cases, but they also aren't testing very much, at least relative to like New York State or Michigan. So when we start thinking about, I think, what the testing rates look like, it's also important to remember that you have different capacities in different states. So here is the coronavirus infection rate as of April 5th. Again, I've mentioned the Daily Yonder already, but I think they do a fantastic job of updating on kind of rural issues. So their writers have really zeroed in on what this means for rural places. Because it's one thing to see videos of New York City being ravaged or Detroit being ravaged. It's another thing to realize that this is in your own backyard. And so when we think about hospital capacity in rural places, in a lot of rural places, there is an implied reliance on the close by urban centers. So while many rural hospitals can handle day-to-day issues, the more severe cases are often shipped out. So Schaefer, you and I are from a part of Oklahoma, Kansas border area that people get bit by rattlesnakes all the time.
That's right, yeah.
So if you get bit by a rattlesnake, they can only handle a few rattlesnake cases a day or even a month in Alva, Oklahoma. Otherwise, they got to ship you to Oklahoma City. So, I mean, this isn't quite rattlesnakes, but I think the point remains that there is a limited capacity in these rural places. So just because you don't see it in the same crazy amount of numbers is probably because you're not testing the same way. And B, it's probably a good thing because even a small increase in the number of cases in your community are going to have very serious implications. I don't know. What do you think, Felicia?
I completely agree with you on that, Trey. And you may have read a recent paper by a recent article by Nate Silver saying, counting cases is completely ineffective. It just has no use whatsoever, precisely because of what you mentioned, that even in the United States, among different cities, let alone the whole rest of the world, testing capacity is completely different. So even if you're reporting 100 cases, is that, does that mean that this is actually like 1/5 of the total number, or is it 1/100th? We don't have that information yet. And that's really problematic.
Felicia and Trey, I think this is the perfect segue into the concept that we've got these huge potential public health benefits of this social distancing, of this trying to freeze the economy. At the same time, we've got this incomplete information with respect to what quantifying those benefits in terms of, I don't actually know what the situation is here in actuality, and I don't know what it would have been had we not had these kind of regulations on our economy. So I want to go back then to the Governor Whitmer's executive order saying that all of these greenhouses do not equate to essential businesses. And so that distinction of essential versus non-essential business and the trade-off between freezing half of the economy or maybe more than half of the economy and the gains in terms of public health. So is this, maybe I should ask, is this essential versus non-essential distinction an effective and maybe the right way to be regulating are managing this disease? I guess I'll turn to Felicia first, since she's smarter than you, Trey.
No, I wouldn't say that.
For anybody that's listening, if you've ever seen a billboard of Michigan State University, you've seen Felicia Wu, because she's very famous. We're really lucky to have her with us.
I wouldn't say that, Trey. That's very kind of you. So to be honest, when you ask that question, Alex, the immediate thought that comes to mind is the social justice aspect, to be honest.
Okay, great.
Because anytime that you say that something is an essential business, that means that there's pressure on the workers in those businesses to keep reporting to work and potentially putting themselves into risky situations. So, and I think we've all been reading recent articles about individuals who were working in food processing plants who became ill with COVID-19 because they were all jam-packed close to each other, working elbow to elbow. And, you know, anecdotal cases of people who were saying that they were sick, that they didn't want to go into work, but then their employer told them, no, you have to report to work. So not only do they go to work sick, but then they endanger everybody else in an enclosed space. And given what we know now about the spread of coronavirus in enclosed spaces, if people are together for over 2 hours, that's, you know, there's a huge risk there. So I think that, and yet it's, yeah, so
on that, could you said, given what we know, can you kind of maybe talk about what we know about the transfer? I think I have a general idea, but I guess I don't know the specifics of it nearly as well as you do, I'm sure.
Absolutely, Trey. So what we know about the coronavirus is that there are a number of different routes of potential exposure and transmission. The coronavirus can be carried in droplets that are expelled by an infected person. That could be through kind of most forcefully and at a greatest distance by coughing or by sneezing. But now it's believed that it could even be transmitted by simply talking, laughing, talking loudly, like emitting droplets into the air. And the whole 6-foot separation idea was the idea that the coronavirus would be confined to the droplets that would then go out a certain distance and then fall to the ground. However, it's also been discovered that coronavirus, well, the droplets can evaporate, and then you've probably heard about the coronavirus being aerosolized. And that means that it's possible to remain in the air for considerably longer, and also possibly at a distance that's longer than 6 feet.
And so sorry, keep going.
And that would help to explain some of the recent, again, these are anecdotes, but this would help to explain, for example, a case that many of us have heard about, which is a choir practice that was taking place in close to Seattle, where none of the individuals who attended this choir rehearsal thought that they were sick with coronavirus. 60 of them came together, they rehearsed together for 2.5 hours. 45 of them eventually tested positive for COVID-19, and at least 2 of them have died. And now articles are coming out about how was it, you know, what was, you know, sort of ground zero in Chicago for the spread of coronavirus in that city. It was believed to be 1 funeral and 1 party.
Wow.
So again, in closed spaces where people are, you know, in close contact, there's the possibility of spread.
So how do we balance those, what you rightly define as a social justice issue, that by requiring, or I've heard even people use harsher terms, holding hostage these people who are characterized as essential workers for the benefit of kind of everyone in America? How do we balance those increased risks to these people with the realization that as a human, I need food to survive. I need to make sure that the police are there, that the firemen are there to protect me. So there are some aspects of economic life that are essential. How do we make that trade-off?
I think, Trey, would have more to say about this than I would, but I would just simply add the case that it's very, very important to protect the workers adequately that are in those essential businesses. And what you say, Alex, is absolutely right. We can't go without food. We can't go without basic healthcare services. We can't go without the police. So what are we doing to protect those individuals? There's a lot of, the use of masks seems to be very appropriate, as well as the appropriate social distancing if it is possible within those confines. And whatever is possible to honor those spaces, including interactions with customers. That's also very important.
Trey, I'll turn to you then, but I also want you to answer the point that she rightly brings up. If we're going to ensure that these people are protected, that's also a costly thing. To whom should we be regulatorily pushing those costs onto?
Yeah, so actually, while you were talking about the social justice implications, I had this kind of memory of, so I grew up not too far from Wichita, and I can remember distinctly when the Obama administration increased taxes on private planes. And from kind of an optics perspective, it makes perfect sense, right? Like, I mean, if you're going to buy a private plane, like, you probably have enough money for higher taxes. But in Wichita, Kansas, where many of those private planes are produced,
absolutely, yeah.
The blue collar workers who live in Wichita, Kansas, and were working on those lines were very offended and upset that all of a sudden their end product was being taxed at a higher rate, which was decreasing the sales of their product.
Offended, upset, and some of them without a job as a result.
Well, for sure. I do think it's interesting in this case, though, because in that case, there was no public health risk associated with that tax, right? So there was no probability that you were going to die because you were making this plane, or maybe it was a low probability because it's a blue collar job. But in this case, it seems to be a far more of a social justice conversation than what is probably, I think, the traditional public policy discussion that we have, in other markets, in other examples. What do you think? Is that fair?
Well, Felicia, do you have thoughts, or I'm hoping?
I'm happy to let you. You have some thoughts on that, Alex. Go ahead.
No, Trey. I want you to keep going in terms of the slide that you've got up right now.
Okay, so this slide is what everybody's probably seen before, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so when we've been trying to think through within my own framework, like what are the essential versus the non-essential, it kind of makes sense to me to think on these baselines, right? So right now, the hierarchy of needs to me suggests that what we're trying to prioritize are safety needs and physiological needs. Where historically food has, I think, at some point been kind of co-opted into this esteem, love and belonging, and self-actualization. We're now thinking about food in this kind of base level of needs, right? So if you go to the grocery store and you have, there's non-GMO salt versus regular salt, which, by the way, they're all non-GMO. Yep. But like, it doesn't. You're not going to not buy it because it's doesn't have the label of non-GMO. You're looking for your physiological needs, and so when we go back to this list of items that are deemed essential versus non-essential, and this continuum where there are certain things like pest control, automotive dealerships, campgrounds, construction that are kind of in this gray area, in the it depends area. I think the goal is to try to break down based on those physiological needs and the safety needs and put those in the camp of essential.
Well, but so there are two sides to the economy, right? There is the side of the consumers, I need this food to survive. There is also the side of the economy, which is this greenhouses, which is I need these sales in this month to survive. How do we balance that trade-off?
What are your thoughts on that? I actually want to know Felicia's thoughts.
So Alex, to be clear, you're asking about kind of so you need to balance this month's budget versus.
So the point there. Well, I'll let Trey knows more about the greenhouse industry.
Well, okay. So if you're going to buy most of your greenhouse products, it's going to come in spring, and we're kind of quickly approaching when most folks are going to be wanting to plant their gardens. They're going to want to be planting and mulching their yards. all of the sales of these companies is often concentrated in a very tight window, and that tight window is getting tighter and tighter as we move forward in this social distancing world. So it kind of ties into this slide that we throw up from the Brewers Association about a brewery staff that's being laid off. So there are projections. This is from a survey of breweries that if you ask them, will you be able to stay or sustain your current business if social measures stay where they are now? We're looking at like half of the breweries in the United States are probably going to close if it lasts more than 3 months. And I think that those exact same numbers would hold for something like a horticulture business or some type of floriculture business that requires its spring sales. So I don't know. This is the hardest trade-off for me to understand, honestly. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
So
Please, yeah.
I just wanted to throw in an idea that could be a possible tiny win-win situation.
Okay.
And this has to do with the individuals who were tested positive for COVID-19 and have survived it, who now have antibodies to protect them against it. This includes one of my friends actually in Seattle, and the question that she and I were talking about is there a role for those individuals who have already survived COVID-19 to kickstart the economy in some way?
Interesting.
In Germany, what they've talked about is having some sort of immunization passport for people who already survived COVID-19 to say, well, we can go out into the economy and we might even be able to help out in a number of different ways, let alone the fact that they might be going to one bar that is specific to individuals who have survived. It's also possible that they could facilitate in deliveries, because I think a lot of us are ordering things via delivery now. Could they be the ones to do it because they're less afraid of being infected by packages or by people who have ordered? Is there something else that small but increasing group of Americans and people all over the world could do in the meantime to begin to ramp up the economy? And that's something that we need to something that we might be able to consider.
It's a wonderful idea in theory. The terms of, again, being able to centrally plan and allocate these people to different areas, sectors of the economy, seems a difficult task, and a difficult task for the free rights Americans to swallow.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate we're kind of out of time, but the problem is that, for as much as I think we all want to tie a bow on all the right answers, I think all three of us are in a very fortunate position that we don't have to make these hard choices.
That's right.
Yes.
So, it's the way that Widmer tried to get around this problem with greenhouses, for example, is by banning the sale in the larger big box stores. So at least trying to prolong the possibility that folks, will be able to plant their garden products and purchase from their preferred outlet, as opposed to being forced into the big box retailers, which were already stealing market share from the smaller producers anyways. But ultimately, I'm so glad I'm not in government, because there is like literally nothing you can choose that isn't going to make somebody mad. And
so we're just going to all wash our hands of this situation and then say,
I can armchair and drink my gin. So
yeah, literally wash our hands.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So.
Well, great. I agree with Trey that it looks like we're out of time. Felicia, you are amazing. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing some extremely helpful answers and thoughts on these areas. If you are still listening, please feel free to send emails to me, Trey, or Felicia, or tweet Trey. Felicia, I don't know if you have a Twitter, but
I don't know.
Share your thoughts as we continue.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to participate. It's always been great listening to the two of you talking about these economic issues, and I've learned a lot too. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks. All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Have a good one. Thanks, guys.